We'll give it a second for everyone to log in.
Goodness, it's so cool to see you all coming.
It's wonderful to have everybody here. Okay, it looks like the number of people coming in is leveled off. So, ladies, are we ready?
Sure.
Okay. Welcome everybody to MSU, a little virtually tonight, but we're really happy to have you here at our discussion. I am Jennifer Carter Johnson. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and I'll be moderating this evening, but I won't be speaking long here because I know you're here to see Professors Grasso and O'Brien. So let me introduce them briefly, and then I'll turn it over to them for discussion. Professor Catherine Grasso is obviously a professor at MSU College of Law. Her interdisciplinary scholarship examines the role of race and other extralegal factors in criminal investigations, trials, and the administration of capital punishments. She teaches criminal procedure, capital punishment law, and a seminar on criminal justice, as well as remedies. Professor Grasso received her bachelor's degree in international studies with a Middle East concentration from Earlham College and a JD from the University of Iowa College of Law. Professor Barbara O'Brien is a professor also at Michigan State College of Law, where she teaches classes in criminal law and procedure and wrongful convictions. Professor O'Brien received her bachelor's degree in economics from Boyden College, a JD from the University of Colorado, and a PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan. Together, their recent work examines the persistent role of race in jury selection and in charging and sentencing decisions relating to capital punishment. Their National Science Foundation sponsored project examines conversation analysis to assess the ways race and stereotypes influence voir dire in capital cases. Professor O'Brien is currently the editor of the National Registry of Exonerations, and Professor Grasso is also the managing editor. The National Registry of Exonerations, which you will hear, I'm sure, much more about tonight, collects, analyzes, and disseminates information about all known exonerations of innocent criminal defendants in the United States from 1989 to present. The registry provides a virtual home for the exoneration stories and also an accessible, searchable statistical database about the cases. With that, I turn it over to the people you want to hear. Professor O'Brien.
Thanks. It looks like we lost Professor Grasso, but I am sure she will be joining us shortly. So I will start the talk, and then when she joins us, she can join in. Okay. As the events of 2020 have shown us, our system of criminal justice is in crisis and has been for a long time. And you cannot begin to unpack the ways in which it falls short, whether you're concerned with over-policing, under-policing, police brutality, the system's debilitating reliance on guilty pleas, over-incarceration, or false convictions, without looking to the history and ongoing pervasiveness of racial discrimination. It can be tempting to approach this problem as one of individual actors expressing their own personal prejudices and biases, either as explicit racial animus or implicit biases. But the closer you look at the system's failings, the harder it becomes to deny the deeper structural ways in which racism infects the system itself, over and above whatever biases the individual actors working in that system may hold. Professor Grasso, it's good to see you back.
I'm so sorry. You know that this is our world in Zoom, right? So as soon as I'm supposed to start talking, of course it crashes. So you want me to pick up?
Sure.
So I was going to start. Can I start in a different way? I was just going to say it is so awesome to see you all here. It's kind of a time warp to see so many students from different years all back in one place. And it's fun to see folks who aren't students too, who've decided they want to hear us. So as she was saying, biases are everywhere. And you who know us at all know that we study the different ways that racism persists and undermines the integrity of the system. Our research examines discrimination in jury selection and in capital charging and sentencing decisions. But we also edit the National Registry of Exonerations. She's the editor. I'm just something else. The registry maintains the nation's only database of wrongful convictions. The registry was founded in 2012, and it's a unique collaborative project between our university, Michigan State, and from the Newkirk Center for Science and Society at the University of California, Irvine, and also of Michigan Law. The registry has come to provide government officials, journalists, attorneys, and really everyone else in the public with authoritative and impartial research on wrongful convictions. When it was first founded, people would say there aren't, there are only a few, it's not that reliable. But now people just turn to the registry and they trust what the registry says. By now, the registry has entered more than 3,000 exonerations its databases, and each of the exonerations is meticulously coded for factors that are associated with wrongful convictions. And then we also, for every single case, we tell the story of what happened, what went wrong, and who is the person who was impacted by this wrongful conviction. Wrongful convictions are, of course, only one marker of the problems with our criminal justice system, but at the same time, they are a distillation of other problems that have taken place at the forefront of our conversations over the last year, specifically systemic racism and discrimination. We see those through exonerations. Unlike our research on jury selection and capital charging and sentencing, our work on wrongful convictions isn't really explicitly about racism. Nonetheless, as I was saying, it tells us a lot about how the system chews up and spits out at least the least powerful, and race is a big part of that. The registry contains thousands and thousands of stories of people who have suffered the most egregious wrongs, but we thought tonight that we would highlight one story in particular, the story of a man named Curtis Flowers. We want to talk about Curtis Flowers because it puts in stark relief how you cannot study these issues, the issues that we study, in isolation. The racism that Mr. Flowers faced infected every aspect of his story. Some of you may know Mr. Flowers' story already. He was the subject of an outstanding podcast, In the Dark, which if you haven't listened to, you should. It's amazing, and we really highly recommend it. The team covered Mr. Flowers' case in season 2, but season 1 is also excellent. You might also be familiar with Mr. Flowers' story because the Supreme Court in 2019 decided an important issue in his case, and it was widely covered in the news. But for anyone who isn't familiar, he was sent to death row in 1996 for a quadruple murder in Mississippi. He was ultimately exonerated in 2020, but that came after 6 trials with shifting theories of the case, multiple reversals for prosecutorial misconduct, Mississippi Supreme Court, which isn't particularly wont to these kinds of reversals, and finally the Supreme Court reversal before the state finally gave up and dismissed the charges. We had worked on Mr. Flowers' case after one of his post-conviction attorneys approached us. Specifically, we combed through the available records. We is kind of a euphemism. Barb did all this work. Through the available records from trial to assess whether the prosecutor, it was the same one, Jack Evans, the whole way through, whether or not he was unlawfully striking back Black citizens on juries. He was, unambiguously. We've examined this issue, as some of you well know, in a number of jurisdictions. And while racial discrimination is ubiquitous and not at all subtle in any of the places, in almost any as we've looked at it, we'd never seen such overwhelming and shameless before or since. And, We might say something like that to be just our opinion, but it isn't just our opinion. The Supreme Court agreed with us. It said the same thing, that this is outrageous, the behavior in this jurisdiction. If the prosecution had discriminated against Black jurors in Mr. Flowers' case, that would be bad enough and sufficient to undermine the integrity of his conviction. But the racism that infected these trials also undermined their accuracy. The whole point of trial is to try to uncover the truth. And here, in this case, it most likely led to a quadruple murderer, the actual killer or killers, getting away with it. Like, we didn't catch the right person. So in addition to working on Mr. Flowers' claim that racism infected the selection of juries for his trials, we eventually had the privilege of adding him to the registry, where we got to tell his story. So with that, I'll hand it over properly to O'Brien.
Hi. So we wanted to use this to talk about the registry. So let me just use this as an opportunity to tell you what we do at the National Registry of Exonerations. A registry entry on an exoneration consists of a narrative and also extensive coding, and all authoritatively researched, written, and fact-checked. The narrative offers a compelling account of the case, and the coding breaks each case into more than 100 specific data points that allows us to see important informative patterns. You can explore the data patterns in a number of ways, but I think this is the most fun way to look at it. So let's share this. If you want, Professor Grasso, you want to share the screen and show them the registry, and then show them Tableau. Okay, so there's the registry website. And then we also have this feature on it. It's an interactive data display. And so, for instance, suppose you wanted to know about the exonerations that happened in Michigan. So you would just go click on Michigan, and you see that there are 126 exonerations, and it tells you who they are, what years they occurred. If you, we have other features too, and I don't worry, I won't go through all of them, but if you could just click on, so that it goes to the whole country again. Thank you. And then just show, a lot of people think that DNA is behind, when they think of exonerations, they think of DNA, but actually if you look, if you can click absent to show the cases where DNA is not a factor, and we see that there's still, it'll take a moment to get there, but there's still the vast majority of exonerations in the registry were not DNA exonerations. So you could play with this if this is something that's interesting to you. The main database, the heart of the registry, begins with looking at exonerations since 1989, which is just like the dawn of the modern innocence era, and that coincides with the use of DNA to start to definitively exonerate people. It has over 2,700 entries. We're adding several every week. I have several on my plate that need to go in there now. And there's also a separate pre-1989 database that has nearly 400 entries. We also issue annual reports, as well as special in-depth reports on important issues, such as our 27 report on race discrimination, wrongful convictions. Last year, we came out with a report on government misconduct in exonerations. But back to the race report, because really, that's sort of the topic that we're discussing tonight. The race report from 2017 noted that African Americans are only 13% of the American population, but a majority of innocent defendants wrongfully convicted of crimes and later exonerated. They constitute 47% of the exonerations that were listed at the time of the report. And a great majority of the 1,800, even more now, innocent defendants who were framed and convicted of crimes in 15 large-scale police scandals and later cleared in what we call group exonerations. Well, in addition to collecting data that we can use sort of in the aggregate to look at overall patterns, we also tell the story of every single exoneree in the registry. We never want to lose sight of the fact that these injustices happen to an individual, someone's son or daughter, father, mother, friend, We want to tell their stories in a way that is clear, factual, and transparent, but that nevertheless shows the human toll of these errors. So for instance, so here's Mr. Flowers' story. And it's a bit longer than our usual entry, although our entries are pretty meaty. But he also had 6 trials. So most exonerees don't have 6 trials to cover. One of our researchers, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Maurice Posley, he combed through all the proceedings of this 24-year saga to tell Mr. Flowers' story. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the whole procedural history of the case. The narrative summary documents how the evidence the prosecution presented shifted and changed from trial to trial, with witnesses recanting and claiming that the police and prosecutor pressured them into testifying that they saw Mr. Flowers near the scene of the crime. I do urge you to read it for yourself. But there's one remarkable incident that I wanted to highlight that sometimes gets lost in all the other outrageous aspects of this case. So the 5th trial ended in a hung jury, and the lone holdout juror was a Black man. One of the other jurors reported that the holdout juror said something during deliberations that arguably conflicted with something he had said during voir dire, which is the process by which the lawyers and the judge talk to the potential jurors to assess their fitness to serve on a jury. The judge then had the lone holdout, an African American, arrested in the courtroom for allegedly having perjured himself. And when Mr. Flowers' attorney objected, the judge threatened to have his attorney, who was also a Black man, arrested as well. The charges against that juror were eventually dismissed, but the message was clear. Now, note this was a very small town, and this trial was very big news. So the message was out. The next time at the 6th trial, the jury convicted. So we chose to highlight Mr. Flowers' story, not only because it's just a horrible and insane travesty, but because it so starkly demonstrates how deeply ingrained and insidious, how baked in the racism was that infected his trial. The discrimination in the selection of his juries wasn't separate and apart from the false conviction. There was a reason the prosecutor didn't want Black people on that jury. He knew he'd have an easier time convincing an all-white jury to convict based on the flimsy evidence. And the stories of the witnesses who later recanted their testimony, several of them said that the detectives had really leaned on and really exploited their vulnerability as poor Black members of this very segregated community to induce them to lie. The lone holdout juror in the 5th trial was a Black man, and he was immediately arrested because his view that the state failed to meet its burden was seen as inherently suspicious. The racism was baked into this whole process. And I think it's especially obvious in Mr. Flowers' case, but we know that it infects the process for countless other defendants. It may be less obnoxiously obvious, but it's still there. And one point I'd like to emphasize, that because I think it's an important reason why the registry exists and why we work so hard to make it what it is. Mr. Flowers' story has been told. Many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with it. The podcast In the Dark had a huge and well-deserved large audience. And on the day this case was argued before the Supreme Court, there were lines around the block of people who wanted to watch it. But that's not true of most, of all or even most exonerees. You know, if you have someone who pled guilty to possessing drugs, and those drugs, you know, it turned out it was an Advil that they had and not a controlled substance, and they pled guilty because they couldn't make bail and they took the plea to get back to their kids, those stories need to be told too. We recently expanded the registry to keep better track of these kinds of exoneration. So if we could show them our groups registry page that we recently launched, this part of the registry, the groups registry, focuses on groups of defendants who are tied together by a common pattern of systemic official misconduct in the investigation and prosecution of their cases, to such a degree that undermine confidence in the defendant's convictions. So for instance, the Gun Trace Task Force in Baltimore, you have the Rampart scandal in California. There's many of you are probably familiar with the lab scandal out of Massachusetts. This portion of the registry is devoted to telling those stories. So even if you consider yourself very knowledgeable about false convictions and you read every story that you see in the media about a case of false conviction, I guarantee you that there are many, many more stories, maybe even thousands, that you've never heard once you start exploring the registry's database that you can find. So I think this is probably a good place to stop for now, and we are very eager to hear your questions and any thoughts you might have.
Thank you both. As I put into the chat, I have several questions that have been pre-submitted by registries, by registrants and participants. But please, if you have questions that have come to you as you've been listening to the presentation, please throw them into the chat and we'll see if we can get to those as well. I basically have three types of questions here for you. A little bit about your work, a little bit about the National Registry of Exonerations itself, and the third category being on racism in the justice system. So let's start with you personally, hear a little bit about your story, and then move into the bigger pictures. How did you two, let's start with something very basic. How did you two get together and start working together on this and other projects?
They hired me. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that. Our mentors, if you can believe it, work together. So at the University of Iowa and University of Michigan, David Baldus, Sam Gross, and Phoebe Ellsworth were people who were really important to our education and our formation and how we became researchers. And so maybe it was preordained that we would meet, but it really is true that Professor O'Brien hired me.
So how do you find the cases? How do you figure out what you're going to work on? You also have NSF funded research. You've done a lot of work on the registry. How do you figure out what you're going to do, and how do you find these cases?
So there's sort of two ways to think about that question. One is sort of how do we find the cases that end up in the registry, which is a whole thing, right? I mean, so the whole point of the registry, it was founded by Sam Gross and Rob Warden from Northwestern, was they observed that, this is something, an exoneration is a big deal in the sense that, like, it's proof that the system failed in a massive, major way. But there was no place that was collecting all of these incidents, right? They would just, you hear some about them in the newspaper, there'd be, smaller subsets. So the big purpose of the registry is trying to find the cases to include, and we have all sorts of, contacts in the innocence world who let us know when the new case is coming down. There's all sorts of searches that we do in just even a simple Google search can sometimes, we have sort of standing Google searches that let us know when cases have been reversed.
This is very much the royal we.
Yeah, we have the staff on the registry. But I guess the other side of that question is, how do we find when we get involved in a particular case that we're actually
like
working on?
Case.
Mm-hmm. So like, for instance, in the Flowers case, I got a phone call from his pro bono attorney saying, we're in post-conviction, we see a strong pattern of racial discrimination. Can you help us with this? And of course I say yes, because how can I say no to that? And we work on it. So we've never sought out any of these cases. Usually we get contacted by some litigator who wants to do, for instance, look at the pattern of jury discrimination or peremptory strike use, things like that. And then we'll work with them to construct a study. I mean, it's very important to keep our independence, right? They tell us what question they want to answer, but then our research is independent, because obviously we're not doing advocacy. We're providing evidence that can be used in advocacy, but we're not doing advocacy ourselves.
Okay, one more kind of personal question before we move into some of the meat of it. I know we have a lot of alumni on here. How many MSU Law graduates have worked for your project at this point? And how many are working for you right now?
So we were we thought someone might ask, and we were trying to count it up, and like dozens of recent grads and some not so recent grads have many people I see on the call have worked for us. And I mean, over the years, we've been doing it a long time. And now I think we have 5 working for us right now. On different projects in different ways. And it's one of the funnest parts of our work is to have these great minds being willing to do really tedious work for us for a few years, and then to see where they go. We always it's always a mixed day when one of our coders, one of our staff attorneys gets a job. Like,
no, don't leave us. Right. Well, and Dean Abisha Taylor.
That's right.
He was he was such a great, he worked with us for so long, and it was so sad to see him go, but I'm so glad he's still part of MSU Law.
We are as well. And so for all of the extended Grasso and O'Brien family who is in our participants tonight, we thank you very much for all of your hard work on all of this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the National Registry itself. How did the exonerees themselves feel about being added to this registry? Because it's a very public thing now.
Okay, so for them, I think overwhelmingly, not to a person, because we're talking about thousands of people. They love it. They see it as a badge of honor. I met one exoneree at an Innocence Network conference, and he said, "Oh, I wanted to meet you because I told my lawyer it wasn't real until I was in the registry." And I was like, okay, no pressure. I feel bad about the cases that are now in backlog that I haven't gotten to yet. But that's really touching. We saw a video that the New England Innocence Project put together, where they had some exonerees talking about their experience. And at the end, they all said, "I'm number 2042. I'm number 2151. Like, they were actually using their number as a badge, right? The number,
Nice.
Every time somebody's added to the registry. So, we had never really thought about it that way. But, now we always get requests like, "What's my number? I want to know what my number is." So I think, there's the one thing I just want to make very, very clear, though, is that everything that we publish on the registry is stuff that we get from publicly available sources of information. Right? We do not contact exonerees. Sometimes they contact us. In fact, we've had exonerations because somebody says, "Hey, my case fits your criteria. Can I be in the registry?" And then we say, "Send us your documents, your decision, the appellate decision or whatever, the trial court decision. We want to see it and we'll look into it." Sometimes we have to say, no, they don't qualify. And that's always really sad. But we never, so we don't go and talk, we don't talk to witnesses. We don't talk to victims. We don't talk to exonerees unless they contact us. It's done. It's all done through publicly available information. So we're never making a judgment. I think this person's innocent. I think this person's guilty, right? It's always based on sort of legal facts, right? That they have to meet certain legal criteria that, but there's nothing that you would read on the registry that you couldn't find in their appellate court decision or newspaper article that was already out there about the case. So that's really important to us, to respect that privacy.
I think to tell the complete picture, though, and part of why Professor O'Brien, I think, talks about that is that sometimes exonerees don't want to be on the registry. So every now and again, they don't want to Google their name and have that be what comes up. They don't want employers. It's rare. It's really, really rare. But because of that, we're really careful that we're not the one that discloses the information. The information's already in the public venue, and then we try to keep good track of it and make it clear.
And so I take it from that, you don't actually have any part in the defense of any of these?
No. So for, I meant, when I was talking about Curtis Flowers, and I said that we had worked on his case, and that was sort of an unusual confluence of events where 2 lines of research intersected. Like, we didn't work on the innocence portion of his case. We worked on the jury selection portion of his case. And we don't do any representation. People who would like to be exonerees, right? People who are fighting and their families are often contacting us, and we provide them with information about innocence organizations like in their area, but we do not do any representation of defendants.
Okay. What type of false convictions do you find are the most common in the registry?
So I could answer that question if I just had pulled up the registry and I could just pull up the number.
Pull it
real
up for
quick.
you. What do you want to look at?
They tend to be disproportionately serious crimes. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? So murder, rape, they're overrepresented in exonerations. And so if you look at sort of all the criminal convictions in the country and then what they consist of, it's going to be mostly misdemeanors.
Right.
We have a lot of murders, rapes, very serious charges. And so does that mean that we aren't making mistakes in the less serious cases? Of course not. It means that the kinds of cases that are going to get the attention of, say, an innocence clinic at a law school or the Innocence Project in New York, those are going to be the types of cases where there's really high stakes. So for instance, you tend to see death cases, capital punishment cases overrepresented. There are tiny percentage of all felony convictions result in a death sentence, but there are a significant percentage of the registry, because if you're serving 5 years, that's horrible, right? Like that's a huge part of your life, and it's not a small thing, but it's not going to be the type of thing that you're going to get the attention of an innocence clinic to work on it. In fact, a lot of innocence clinics have so many cases, so many requests for help that they have set up criteria. So things like you have to have at least 10 years left on your sentence or something like that. So we tend to see the more serious crimes represented by exonerations. And that's why it's always important to remember that exonerations is our best proxy for a false conviction, but it's not the same thing as a false conviction, right? The exonerations are only the false convictions we know about. We have no idea what false convictions out there that people are doing time or have done time or maybe even got probation for a crime that didn't happen, and we'll never know because it'll never result in an exoneration.
Thank you. How is this work funded? How's the registry funded?
From viewers like you. So there's funding from, we have some very generous donors. Our primary costs of operating the registry is our staff. We have 2 researchers who are former journalists, and we have 1 researcher who is a former public defender. That's the big bulk of our we don't get paid for it, right? I get my MSU Law pays me for my work. I don't get paid by the registry.
Well, I think that's the starting point.
What?
That the editors at the registry are all full-time faculty. And so the universities support the research that's going on, but they don't support any of the staff of the registry. So that is a huge expense that we pay by really it's the only other expense, which we pay mostly by one very donor, but also through grants and through donations from anyone else who's willing.
Yeah, so we just spend a lot of time thinking about how to raise money that, is not exactly how I wanted to spend my time, but it's for a good cause.
Well, we thank you for your service, because
thank you.
There are many other things as a faculty member I know that you could be spending your time on. So we do thank you for donating your time to this particular endeavor.
And I thank MSU Law for supporting me in that endeavor.
We're happy to have you. Okay, so let's move then from the registry to racism in criminal law and criminal justice in general. When you say racism is baked into the system, what do you mean? What does that mean?
It's a good question.
What I mean in part is that the system gives a leg up to people, to white people, in the same way that it makes things harder for Black people, for people of color generally. And I recently was reading for a class and found an example that just feels so clear. Where I grew up, when young men usually used bad judgment and got in trouble, they had lots of opportunities to not end up with criminal conviction on their record. There were programs, there was peer mentorship, there was the sheriff called my mother, like there were lots of opportunities. But I don't think those same opportunities are equally available in other jurisdictions. So in urban and or even just Black communities, I think there tends not to have been made available the same resources. So then, without anybody meaning in a really active way for it to have happened, the children who come from where I grew up will not have a criminal record, even though they, so, you know, then they do something else stupid when they're older. They get involved in a way that's not their best moment. And they have no record, whereas someone coming from a poorer and Blacker neighborhood would have a criminal record where it's over policed in a different way. So that sort of just reality of lived experience gives, you see it in educational systems in a simpler way, right? The quality of education in one community versus the other isn't the same. So we see the cost of that in what portends to be an objective application of the law. Right? It's just a small possession crime. It's just everyone's getting charged the same. The weight of the drugs was the same. Not even talking about the crack versus powder difference. Just saying everyone has a little bit of whatever drug's illegal. It looks different in different people's experiences. And the more I look, the more I understand, the more ways I see that privilege is, we saw it recently in demonstrations, right? How one riot happens one way, but I feel like it's more subtle than we're willing to see a lot of times. And that the better we get at naming it, the better we get at identifying it, the better we can change it. It's all our choice. As I always say to my students, the police work for us. We ask them what we want them to do.
And I think that something you just said is several of the questions brought up the question of how you disentangle race from economic issues, because of intersectionality, of course, is a huge piece of all this. But you just gave two examples of a rural, probably not hugely wealthy area that's my guess would be predominantly white, versus an urban area that's probably predominantly Black. And it just shows how all these different pieces come together. So
yeah, it's not to say that white people don't get screwed over by the system. They absolutely do. And that, you know, being a poor white person is, you're at a much bigger, you're at a huge disadvantage compared to a rich white person, right? Like you don't see too many rich people in jail. So of course, right? Like, of course, economics has a lot to do with it. But I mean, I think, you know, this is kind of hard to pin. It's hard for me to point to something concrete about this, but just sort of just the national conversation about the opiate crisis, that you know, yes, there is still probably too much criminalization of people with addiction problems, but people tend to talk about it as a public health crisis, right? That people are sort of sucked up into this thing, which we don't really see with drug crimes that are, whether accurate or not, are associated with populations of color. And you know, there might be lots of reasons for that maybe we're evolving to think about drugs differently, but it's really hard to miss the race piece of it, in that this is something that is, at least whether, you know, I don't know the precise statistics of who suffers from opioid addiction, but it has a white face, right? In the public perception, it's a white person pandemic.
And so, in light of some of the various conversations that we're finally beginning to have around this issue, based on a lot of the work that you guys have done, have we seen any meaningful reforms in the criminal justice system that we can look to for some hope?
We actually have, in some really thoughtful ways. And I see a question in the chat that's kind of connected to it too. Like, what can we do that's different? How can we avoid these biases in jury selection in particular?
Mhm.
And we've been watching the state of Washington for several years, where the Washington Supreme Court uh, um, undertook to learn and to study the problem. So in jury selection, the challenge of using a peremptory strike is that the rule is that a prosecutor or defense counsel can strike for any reason or no reason, but not race, right, or gender. And so typically the Batson rule is thin. It doesn't have much teeth. It doesn't help in discrimination the way it might have been intended to. And the Washington State Supreme Court held a whole seminar in the summer, invited the public organizations to come into the conversation, and thought about what would be reforms to make it so when we select a jury, we don't close out our people of color. Like, how do we make it so that we welcome to our juries? And they made some really, really like wise decisions. Like they said, you can't say that it's the way they were sitting or what their attitude was. That's not a good reason, because you might not have understood that properly. And you can't say because someone in their family had criminal backgrounds, because that might be something that is actually not evenly, everyone in our society might not have an equal likelihood of having experienced that. And one of them. And they also changed the proof to say, I think this is an improper strike. And so the first Washington State did it. And then more recently, California has passed a law copying Washington State, in which they're trying to work better with jury selection. And it's so exciting. I mean, it's really has an opportunity to make people be included instead of excluded. So we can decide to make decisions that are not based on our guts, right? To instead decide ahead of time that who might not be a good juror, but not because of our gut.
And I mean, you also cannot, I mean, you can't overestimate the power of prosecutors in our system. I mean, prosecutorial discretion is a feature of it's a bedrock feature of our system, that you cannot charge every single crime that comes across your desk that police bring to you. So you set priorities. And what we're seeing now in several large jurisdictions, people are running for the job of prosecutor, not on the I'm tough on crime platform, but we're going to think really carefully about how we use our resources. And we see that these certain prosecution policies have this disparate impact, and we're not going to do that anymore. And there's often a lot of resistance from law enforcement against the prosecutors. And what you're seeing in LA right now, they've elected a new prosecutor who is basically instituting policies like, we don't prosecute, unless there's some special factor that makes it particularly aggravated, we're not going to prosecute certain low-level crimes that tend to be disproportionately affecting certain underprivileged communities. And you're getting pushback just from the line prosecutors themselves. So, it's not all like, okay, so now we have a prosecutor who is really focused on meaningful criminal justice reform. We're all set. There's still resistance within some of these offices and within the law enforcement community. But it's really interesting. So, I was always really skeptical of the term progressive prosecutor. And, sometimes they sort of talk a good game and they get elected and they just kind of do the same old stuff. But we really are seeing some now. You have Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. I think it's Gascon in LA. I may be misremembering his name, who do seem to be implementing genuinely, I think, much more sort of conscious much more sort of, they're much more conscious of sort of the perhaps unintended consequences of charging decisions and sort of taking responsibility for that and really factoring that in how they want to use their resources.
On the
Even
flip side,
the prosecutorial races have been interesting. Like the kinds of issues that are considered important in the races has been a different moment. Sorry, I interrupted you.
no. That's great. I was going to ask on the flip side, and this is one of the questions from the chat. Have you found any patterns of prosecutors in justice or judges where false convictions and such based on race have been more prevalent? I don't know if you have the numbers to do that.
I do, not at my fingertips.
Well,
So there's
you'll
definitely
see some of it in the report that I put in the chat. Like some you'll
Okay.
see that.
and the OM report, or the government misconduct report.
That's what I put in the chat.
Oh, okay, thanks. I didn't know that.
But Barb, what I was going to say is what might be interesting in some ways when we know more, it's because of something else that's going on. Mostly we don't know. So for example, the quality of the conviction integrity units in different parts of the country is really different. And Barb, you'd do better than I would talking about, for example, the one in Michigan, right, where we have a ton of exonerations, but some because they do excellent work.
Yeah, I mean, so, usually when I talk about the registry, sorry, this wasn't a question about exactly about the registry, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. I always give this huge caveat, we cannot, this is not a database that tells, this is not an accurate cross section of false convictions. We don't have that. That's the $1 million question that we all want to know. This is just a sample. It's not it's not an unbiased sample. It's a skewed sample. So for instance, you can look, if you look at that Tableau map that we showed, it looks like, wow, Michigan is doing much worse than Mississippi. They're getting so many more false convictions in Mississippi. But maybe we're just better at catching the mistakes because we have Val Newman heading up the conviction integrity unit in Wayne County, who's just doing an incredible job, right? In the first year of operation, they had something like 6 exonerations. So you look at, the number of exonerations and you say, does that mean they're just really doing a terrible job in Wayne County, for example, and they're convicting all these innocent people? Well, maybe, or maybe they're just doing a really good job uncovering it. And maybe in another state that has very few false convictions, it's not because they're doing such a great job and they're not falsely convicting people. Maybe it's because they're not figuring out they made the mistakes. So that's, yeah, so I think that's sort of speaks to what you were saying, Catherine, that it's we only know what we know, and we kind of have a sense of what we don't know, but even that we don't really know. But yes, the government misconduct report that Catherine put in the chat, that talks a lot about how different patterns emerge. You can sort of see some racial patterns. We have it in the race report, but it's really hard to disentangle.
I love the question. I see it in the chat now about, how hard it is to push back against parole boards, right? To convince people that someone's innocent. And that is my overall impression, that the work of people who bring these cases and figure out how to, so, when we had DNA, when there's DNA, it's a lovely thing, but that's not most of these cases. And to try to marshal the evidence to set it right when it's gone, because you all know this, you've all studied criminal law and know that the presumption of innocence goes away, right? Once someone's convicted, everything is against the person, and it's extraordinary how much luck in some ways it takes to be able to get the case.
A lot of people are asking what kind of practical tips.
I messed up how I was posting things. I'll fix it.
I was going to say, a lot of people are asking for some practical tips. Do you have anything about how to either
like the lawyers?
What's that?
What, like we're lawyers?
Like you're lawyers? I know, right? They actually want to know how to do something. I
don't know how practical.
How do you either avoid your own internal biases when you're maybe a prosecutor or on that role? Or how do you look for internal biases in your jurors that maybe you don't want those particular jurors on your panel?
So I have kind of bad news. I think, of course, it's really good to interrogate your own biases and to, it's incredibly important work and everybody should do it. And we all could do that kind of work and it never ends, right? Like that sort of questioning your own assumptions, your stereotypes, your own internal biases. However, there's sort of a tendency to think about these problems at the level of the individual. That these problems exist because people are doing bad things, whether it's the overt racism or it's something more subtle that the person isn't aware of. I think that can only go so far, right? Like I really think that we have to start thinking about the structure. So to the extent you're a prosecutor and you have power, you're still subject to you're still subject to the policy set forth by your boss. And you might be limited in what you can do. But to the extent you can advocate for policies that really think not about so much the intent behind them, but the impact that they have, I really think that that's the kind of thing that's going to have that has the greatest potential for change. I just think there's, we all have to do work on ourselves, but that only gets us so far if we still have these structures in place. For last year, the Supreme Court decided the case of Pena v. Rodriguez, in which it struck down the Louisiana, it struck down non-unanimous juries. Said you have to have unanimous juries in these criminal cases. And the court noted that when the non-unanimous jury rule was adopted in Louisiana, it was adopted explicitly because they were worried about Black people serving on juries. Like they said, like, if we're going to have Black people on juries, we better make sure they don't have enough power. Like there was nothing subtle about it. And that rule persisted long past anyone would say that out loud or even think that conscious. I mean, some people always will, and people just, because that was the rule and it seemed race neutral, right? Like it just said non-unanimous juries, doesn't have anything to do with race. But that thing was put in place to preserve white supremacy, right? A racial hierarchy. And it persisted long past anybody acknowledging or remembering. They weren't teaching that in schools. People weren't aware that was the origin. So this is an example of a system that the actors operating in that system weren't thinking necessarily about its racist origins, and that it was designed to keep it. And the studies of how it operated showed that actually it was more likely that jurors of color were the ones in the minority who were not, were having that they could get a guilty verdict, even though there'd be maybe two people of color who disagreed. So it did have a racially disparate impact. But nobody was thinking about it that way. They had to really build this case and show to the Supreme Court and to the voters when they ultimately had repealed it, why this was racist. And I think that to that extent, I think an individual can make a difference by sort of really being committed to saying, these things have these racist roots. And they continue to have these racist effects, even if we don't think of it that way. You can get rid of everybody's implicit bias in the world. It's not going to solve that problem until you fix the structure.
And I would say that it's always worthwhile that it's good for offices to study these things, to think about it, to understand that their stereotypes are interfering with their work, that their racism makes them less qualified to do their jobs, and that so a prosecutor's office that's striking all the Blacks on the assumption that Blacks don't have crimes and aren't tough on crime is missing out on some excellent jurors. I mean, so I think that there's that for some of the progressive prosecutors out there, they've had a hard time with their line prosecutors. This has not been easy, just to elect a progressive and convince everyone that this new approach was good. But I think the situation where there's been opportunity for learning has been more successful. So I don't know, it seems like there are a lot of people working and thinking about how to do better and how to make the systems more fair. So I think
And I would be remiss if I didn't say you got to collect data, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
always.
we measure what we care about, and the state of the collection of data in the criminal justice system, it's so patchy. It's so hard to get your hands on good data. When we do these, you think like the research we do should be super easy. The jury selection research should be super easy. We're just looking at numerators and denominators for the most
Well,
part.
and everybody was there, right?
Yeah, it's all out in the
They
open.
selected the jury. Like you think they could just tabulate it.
My student who wrote a paper on this issue just said, it sounds familiar. It's like, this should be something, sometimes we do more sophisticated analyses, but sometimes the work we're doing is just like, count them up. What's the numerator? What's the denominator? And just look at a fraction. Like it's not high level math, but just getting your hands on the data. Like when we care about things, we have good data on it. We keep track of it. Just think about your own life, what you pay attention to and what you don't. Like, how many steps I get in a day, I can tell you that, but I can't, like that's, so getting our hands on data to be able to actually ask these questions is so difficult. Like that would be a great first step. Just, like advocate for better record keeping.
So what makes it so difficult to get the data?
Because it just doesn't exist in any one spot, right? So if I want to know who was called in for jury duty, what was their race, who struck them, who got to sit on the jury, it's almost like I'm asking for state secrets, the way that it's in like, this is stuff, these are some of these cases. Yes, some of these cases are 20, 25 years old, but some of them happened in the last couple of years. And we're like, can we just get the racial composition of the jurors who showed up? And it's like, and it's not that they're, like they're,
or even, so recently, even to get a complete transcript, like there should be a transcript in a case that's gettable, even if it's not prepared yet. It should be accessible. And we have 2 cases we're coding right now where we're missing a volume, like just a random section. Someone checked it out. Now we do. So I think that there is some issue with the data that we want. You don't want jurors' names all over the place. There's nothing I hate more than when the Supreme Court is talking about some poor person who was or wasn't eligible to serve on a jury because of something that did or didn't happen to her. I mean, it's just terrible. I mean, they've got to be so embarrassed. It's never.
Yeah, they just show up for jury duty. They didn't ask for this.
It's never because they got a PhD in psychology, right? That's not what they're talking about. And so I do think that we don't have to destroy this data. We could decide as a jurisdiction or as a nation that we keep it, that we number the jurors. We don't care their names. If you give us their race and their juror questionnaires, we don't need more than that. But we've actually proposed this in writing. We've actually tried to push this, and we've advocated for it, but I don't think we have any jurisdictions who've taken us up on it yet. And even think about this question. We study charging and sentencing, right? You would think that I could get a list of murders reliably.
Like it's kind of a big deal. You think somebody would be keeping track.
Like you should count. And like I've done all kinds of things over the years. When I studied the military, it was the prison that gave me the best list. Who got admitted on homicide? I don't even want to talk about California, which I've gone 1,000 rounds in the last 6 months trying to get basic data.
That sounds so frustrating. Okay, we're almost out of time, so I have one final question for you. We have in our participants, our attendees list, a mix of both attorneys, law students, and non-lawyers, people who are just interested in this. What can they do to help? What can we all do to help in making our criminal justice system a more equitable place for everybody?
Be informed voters when you vote in prosecutorial and judicial elections. And that's easier said than done. I haven't always done that to the extent I should. And here I am up here preaching it to all of you. So I think, if I sort of think of like a concrete thing you can do, it is, pay attention to the lawmakers and the people who are enforcing those laws and the people who are interpreting those laws. Because for too long, it's just been about being tough on crime. And the reality is that's rhetoric to the extent that they're not evenly tough on crime. I mean, can you imagine if they enforce marijuana laws on campus the way they enforce it in certain neighborhoods? back when, marijuana was criminalized, like, but these are the kinds of things people could get, lawmakers could write really draconian laws because they didn't worry, because they knew the prosecutors weren't going to go after everybody with it. And the people they went after are less powerful. So if we can be more attentive as citizens and voters to who we are electing, and not just voting for the person whose sign you saw on enough lawns, like, I think that's one concrete, it's just one thing that
I
we
think
can
these
do.
local elections have turned out to be really important. So I also would say run for office. Don't not. You guys are qualified. All of our grads are qualified to run for office. And right now, local city councils are making important decisions. There's just a major study was just released today or yesterday on the influence of race on police stops in East Lansing, right? Where the outcome is exactly what you'd expect it to be. And the place that has the power to make a difference is the city council, which, has a Michigan State grad on it. You can, a Michigan State student on it usually. Run for city council and be engaged in helping us think about how to help our police be the police we want, and our prosecutors to be the prosecutors we want.
And that's true, really, no matter whether you're in a large city or a small city.
Mhm.
There are places to make a difference, no matter where you are in the world, really. So
I'm not running for office, I can tell you that much.
Thank you all for coming. It has been so much fun to see everyone, and in the chat, in the participants list, I just love seeing you all, and stay in touch.
Thank you all.
Thank
Great to
you.
see you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're out of time. I know you're all applauding the professors from your home. We can all feel your love from here.
Mhm.
We very much appreciate it, and keep in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.